Okay. All right, we'll get started. Thank you for everyone being here. And this is a session on privacy, anonymity, and warrantless access to subscriber identification data. And a lot of people are used to the terms privacy and anonymity, but probably find the last term, warrantless access to subscriber ID data, quite obscure. Basically, the theme of this panel is this. Anonymity is privacy about identity. Privacy about identity. And whenever privacy is infringed by the state for criminal investigation or for other purposes, we usually have procedural safeguards such as warrant and other probable cause standard, things like that. But for some reason, when it comes to infringement of privacy on anonymity, or when it comes to infringement on privacy on identity, many laws, many countries, including the US, UK, France, Germany, Korea, do not subject infringement of that privacy on identity, to procedural safeguard. And we want to talk about, whether that's a good practice, whether we should make any change. So to talk about that, we have a fabulous panel today, starting with David Kaye, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and Khadija Rodriguez, International Director at EFF, Kelly Kim, OpenNet Korea, Luis Garcia from R3D, Digital Rights Defense Network in Latin America, Ted Kim, our only private sector representative, CEO of Private Internet Access, who provides anonymous access to the internet to the users, and Nicole Ozer, Technology and Civil Liberties Director at ACLU California, who has very good news for you and for the world on this issue, I think. So let's give a round of applause for the panelists, just to encourage. And so I posed the question. Why is infringing on privacy, on identity, not subject to procedural safeguard when the police infringement on other types of privacy, like opening up the envelopes or coming into your homes, those are all subject to warrant requirement. But when the police try to lift the anonymity, when they try to find out the identity of you, why is it not subject to the heightened, the procedural safeguard that's applicable to other types of privacy infringement? And what do you think about that from international human rights perspective?
So thanks for the applause. It's good to be in a panel where you get the applause first, particularly when there's I hope KS's point wasn't that you might not applaud at the end, so we got to get it at some point. So I'm particularly grateful that KS put together this panel, and like you, I want to be in a position to learn. So I want to say a couple of things about anonymity, maybe from a general perspective, as a generalist more than anything else. My experience in putting together our report last year to the Human Rights Council on encryption and anonymity was interesting. I don't know if this reflects sort of a public view, but we did a public call for submissions on the issues of encryption and anonymity, both seeking civil society, but also government views on the topic. What are the laws that regulate in this space? What are the policies that are infringing on encryption or digital security and anonymity? And interestingly, almost all of our submissions, with a few really important exceptions, but most of our submissions focused on the encryption side and less so on the anonymity. And even though there were some submissions on that, I wondered at the time why there was a bit of a reluctance on the issue of anonymity. And I'm not sure why. I mean, maybe that's one of the issues we can talk about. I wonder if it's a little bit harder to talk about anonymity as a matter of law and as a matter of policy than it is to talk more generically about digital security. And if there's sort of law enforcement and national security reasons that are involved there. But that was the first sort of reaction I had when we were doing the report was why isn't there more interest and focus and concern about anonymity? Why is that? And what are the protections that I think human rights law provides? So the why, actually I'm not going to answer the why. I'd like to hear from others about the why. I think that as what international law, the human rights law, and I'm talking about mainly about Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also other issues related to physical integrity and privacy, I think demand an understanding that anonymity is a critical tool in a number of ways. It's a critical tool for access to information, particularly for vulnerable communities, but also for anybody who wants a kind of zone of privacy in order to pursue her or his curiosities. And so anonymity provides that kind of zone in a way that encryption on its own can't, because encryption only protects, as everybody in the room I'm sure knows, encryption only protects the content of the communication, but doesn't protect necessarily our identity. So I think it's really important to start off from the sort of the foundation that anonymity is a critical way to access information for many people around the world. And the other thing I'd say about anonymity, in addition to access to information, is that it's an important tool for individuals to communicate with one another and to develop community. So there's also a freedom of association element to anonymity as well. Now, these kinds of principles, I think, as a matter of human rights law, are seen as easy to overcome because the restrictions in Article 19 in particular, which I think the restrictions are narrow, and the restrictions allow for a legitimate restriction in the case of where it's provided by law and where it's necessary to protect a specific interest, such as national security or law enforcement, that law enforcement issue gets overweighed, that in the balance there, which I think is an inappropriate way to look at, but in terms of balance, it's very often the case, I think, that governments tip the balance in favor of law enforcement. Now, this is certainly true of digital security generally, but they put a heavy hand on the law enforcement side, in particular on anonymity. We see this in the case also, not just in terms of warrantless access, but we see it in the context of the banning of masks in public protests. And I'm afraid that kind of sort of banning of anonymity when it comes to criticism of government is moving from that public space, the analog space or the physical space, to a space that is digital. And so from my perspective, that's something to fear. And this is the topic of this panel is one aspect of that.
One theory that has been proposed is that, many privacy laws distinguish communication content from communication metadata, and the identification of the parties to a communication seem to fall under metadata, and then the laws usually put lower procedural obligations on access to metadata as opposed to access to the content. But if you think about it, I thought about it, but also the Canadian Supreme Court in 2014 on the case called Spencer, said, okay, well, there's this anonymous content online. If the police identify who wrote it, then that is equivalent to, the police just get the identity data, but it is equivalent to actually accessing the confidential data of a known person, because the end result is you now have one full set of the communication content and the identified person. In that reasoning, the court struck down the Canadian law allowing warrantless identification of an otherwise anonymous communication. Other panelists can come back to that. Now, Khadija worked on necessary and proportional principles, which is a document signed by more than, 400 organizations now? 500 civil society organizations, and is being cited heavily by international law scholars and international standard bodies. So okay, well, yes, David Kay also cited necessary and proportional principles. So what's your perspective on this differential treatment?
Well, when we start developing the principles, one of the issues that we also care about is privacy of identity. One of the things that we see, at least in different laws, when we were trying to assess and analyze the national laws in other countries outside the United States, is that there were this kind of different treatment for different protection of personal data. It's even worse. For instance, in Latin America, the laws are very dispersed. Each law have different legal protection for the same kind of data, and they contradict each other sometimes. That's the case in Brazil, when the court have say something in one area and then say something else in another area. There is a specific law that authorizes directly the civil police and the prosecutor to access subscriber information directly from the providers without any court order, without any process to challenge the request for unmasking the identity of a speaker. So we thought that while developing the principles, it's important that we just don't create different legal protection for different kind of data, but because it's creating a lot of confusion for interpretation, for say, oh no, this is content, no, this is metadata, this is subscriber information. And what is that? And different laws, because what we found in many countries in Latin America, and just a little let you know, we are finishing a comparative legal analysis of surveillance laws in 13 countries. And one of the findings is that you find it in many, many, many laws. We don't have like a Electronic Privacy Act, we don't have a single law that will regulate all the surveillance powers on criminal matters. We just have it very dispersed, and some even are administrative laws. They are not even laws, like prescribed by law, on the formal sense of the law, but there are even administrative laws that are regulated surveillance powers. In any case, so when we were developing principles, we created this concept of protected information, and we said that no matter which kind of data is, you need to comply with these principles, because you need to assess the proportionality of the request. You have to evaluate like the sensitivity, the seriousness of the crime, or of the crime, and the sensitivity of the information, and how much is this a serious infringement in human rights. And you have to apply the proportionality principles and necessity principles, and you need to do so probably at different levels, even with subscriber data. And you need like a specific test for requiring to disclose this information. But sadly, the practice have won us, and the police are just asking, or the prosecutors or the police are asking directly the information to the providers, and there are not even very good decisions with some exceptions, I think. I think, about it. So I don't know. I think that that's something that we have to think through, that we need clear processes, and that we cannot keep thinking on creating artificial definitions of categories based on technical definitions of whether this is content, this is metadata, this data in transfer, this is stored in the cloud for 180 days. Instead, we should just evaluate how sensitive this is for the infringement of human rights and the seriousness of the threat, the legitimate aim, whether national security or whether criminal matters.
Luis, do you want to speak about situation in Latin America?
Yeah, well, particularly in Mexico, where we work, I think this is particularly what Kavita is mentioning, a problem in Mexico. There's very creative interpretations and very inconsistent jurisdictional decisions. For example, and now let me tell you a little bit about the story. First, what the authorities wanted was everyone to register their SIM cards and their phone numbers. And they created this huge database of information in which only half of the users, there was a deadline for people to register, and supposedly if you don't register after the deadline, you would lose your communications. Obviously, telcos freaked out because only 50% of their consumers registered, and they didn't want to lose 50% of their other consumers. So eventually, the government backed down and said, okay, well, we're not going to deactivate everyone's phone. But the database stayed there. The database is available in the black market, in the internet. Not even, you have to be very shady about it. And they said, okay, yeah, it failed. We invested all this money in the database that was never used, that got leaked. But we're going to do something different with data retention. We make companies retain all this metadata, and we'll give warrantless access. So there's been some judicial decisions by Supreme Court, particularly, that are not consistent. On one part, one decision is that metadata is also protected in the same way as content of communications. In Mexico, you have a constitutional right to protection of your communications, and that you need a judicial federal warrant, if that's what it said. So there's one decision by the Supreme Court that says that. But there's some loopholes that have been created by the same Supreme Court or by other laws. And for example, one of the metadata that is retained is, for example, location data of phone number. It was first 12 months, and now it's 24 months of every subscriber. It's a massive, there's no exceptions. Everyone's metadata is retained for 2 years, including the location data of the phone, historical location data. And in theory, based on the first decision of the Supreme Court, you would think that you would need a judicial warrant to get access to that location data. And some authorities, we know they do, but that's not the only problem. The other problem is that we don't know which authorities think that they have authority. And you ask telcos in Mexico, and they get requests by the Army or the Navy or authorities that don't really have a basis in law to request this. And some telcos, they comply, sometimes they don't comply, and it's very shady about why and when they do that, because normally if they give access to information, no one will know. They just gave it to the Army, and the only people who know are the Army and the telco, and that's it. So that's a problem. But the other thing, and the worst thing, is that the same Supreme Court that said that you have to have a judicial warrant to get access to metadata has also said that when you want to get location, you want to track a phone in real time, that is location data in real time to the future, then you don't need a warrant, which is strange because it's the same data. I mean, you need a warrant to get historical location data, but you don't need a warrant to get real-time data, which is, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And the reasons and it will really end with this, the reasons why the Supreme Court have given in public, because the hearings by the Supreme Court are transmitted in TV, in a channel that no one sees but me. And the argument is it's because the data is, you're not tracking a person, you're tracking a phone, and the phone doesn't have rights. And that's literally what they have said, for example. And they have become even more creative in the way that there was a decision in which there were two courts having different opinion, and then the Supreme Court decided who was right. What happens when the police comes and finds a phone in the scene of crime? Some judges were saying you don't need a warrant to get access to that phone because you don't know who that phone is, and some were saying you do need a warrant. The court said initially that you do need a warrant, the Supreme Court, but now there's a new law that tries to overrule that, and we'll see how that's going. Us in our organization is challenging many of these laws. In the coming weeks, we're probably going to have a decision on the telecommunications law. We're fighting against data retention itself, trying to emulate the decision of the European Court of Justice. But also we are worried about the lack of safeguards, lack of clarity about who can access data. Do they need a warrant? What other safeguards there are? Transparency, independent supervision, the right to notification, all these things that are missing, that are just, the law is very vague, and when the law is vague, then there's arbitrarity and abuse. You know? And you just want to, this is really the last thing that's really important, that this is not, in the case of Mexico and many countries in the global south, this is not just this bourgeois luxury right that I don't want the government to know if I went to Starbucks. No, this is a life or death decision, especially in countries such as Mexico, in which in many cases the distinction between the authorities and organized crime is non-existent. So this debate about security versus privacy takes a different dimension in countries such as Mexico, in which if you give powers, unfettered powers to the government, you are probably, or in some cases at least, giving those powers to organized crime to use against society. So in the case of Mexico, and I think the case of everyone, but just in this context, privacy and anonymity is security, not the other way around.
Okay, well, you just said privacy and anonymity are both important. Has the Supreme Court, has the Mexican Supreme Court say anything about, I mean, mostly you talked about metadata and the Supreme Court talked about metadata, but has the Supreme Court said anything about identification data on otherwise anonymous communication?
They haven't.
Nothing specific?
Not specifically, but
Okay.
I mean, as we all know, and many research shows, location data, it's identification data. If you have location data, either historical or in real time, you will eventually know who that person is. No?
You can kind of infer the address, and the address usually becomes a
Exactly.
gateway to the identity, yes.
I think the issue that I haven't found like rules for private information like you have in the U.S. So when we talk about in the U.S., at least when I hear my colleagues, because I'm not a U.S. lawyer, talk about subscriber information is the data that you use when you register a system, is the bill address that you provide to the telecom companies, and it's the phone number and it's your name. That's all. And then they have other categories of data, metadata,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily private data, right? And so for subscriber data, I didn't find many regulations that deal with that. There are one case that says that subscriber in Brazil that says that the law enforcement can access subscriber data without a warrant. And then there is one particular law, which in Brazil, that says that they can access directly that data without a problem. So that's what mainly found out. And then in Argentina, they said that it's not protected under the Constitution because it only protects papers.
Yeah. I mean, this is what gets me. Like, if you, I mean, you can analogize access to subscriber ID data to the police forcing you to, forcing you to present your identification that's in your backpack, right? I mean, usually for the police to open up your backpack, they'll need a warrant or something equivalent, some warrant exception, right? Some constitutional exceptions to warrant requirement. But for the police to open up your bag to get your identification card, you don't need a warrant. and you don't need anything equivalent. And I think that this is something that's very critical to me. And I've thought about why the laws in all these countries still allow warrantless identification of people communicating. Maybe these laws are outdated. Maybe these laws are dated from the time when, like, people in whole town shared one phone to make that change. So I mean, this easy availability of identification data on the people communicating can cause a lot of crazy results. So I'm going to ask Kelly to talk about what's going on in Korea, and you'll hear some numbers. And just to, I forgot to talk about this. On your table, there is a one pager that you can read. I mean, not now. Please read after you hear the presentations. If you miss the numbers, there are citations that you can refer back to. So, Kelly?
Yeah, okay. So I will present South Korea as the worst case scenario. So we have this law, the Telecommunications Business Act, which allows telecommunications operators to release to the investigatory authorities their subscriber ID data without being presented with warrant. So telecommunication operators include telcos, ISPs, and online service providers. And subscriber ID data includes users' names, resident registration numbers, called RRNs, and addresses, phone numbers, IDs, and the date of subscription or termination. Well, some of the information, especially RRNs, are personal information very strongly protected by our rigorous data protection regime in Korea. And just for your information, Koreans are given this unique identifier, this unique number at birth, and the number can be used as a node to link all kinds of information of that person, from bank account information, like healthcare information, to phone numbers and IDs. Telecommunication operators retain those information. Almost all data requests, like higher than 90% are being automatically filled by the operators without any evaluation. And this easy access has given the investigatory authorities an incentive to make even more data requests. So in fact, the authorities are using this measure to circumvent due process under the criminal procedure laws. So accordingly, while about 6 million people's data was accessed warrantlessly in 2011, the number has rapidly increased to reach almost 13 million in 2014, despite the fact that major internet companies have stopped complying with the data requests from November 2012. So to repeat, in 2014, year 2014 alone, about almost 13 million people's ID data was accessed by the investigatory authorities, including National Intelligence Service. Considering that Korea is roughly about 15 million people, that means about like 26% of total population had been the targets of the mass surveillance in just 1 year, and which converts to about like 36,000 people every day. So like anonymous communication is virtually impossible in Korea. And not only the data is accessed warrantlessly, there's no notification requirement in the law, and the telcos responsible for more than 90% of the data access, had refused to disclose to their users whether their ID data was accessed. Even when the users asked them whether their request for like disclosure. So there was no way that a user may find out whether his or her ID data was accessed warrantless by the investigative authorities. Well, then the High Court decision came in last year's January last year, awarded the damages to the users who got their disclosure requests turned down by 3 major telcos in Korea. And our advocacy upon the decision has been very successful, and now the users can find whether their ID data has been warrantlessly accessed by making online disclosure requests to the telcos. And this March, very controversial Counterterrorism Act was enacted in Korea, which granted the National Intelligence Service enhanced capability to monitor terror suspects. Okay. So it includes yet another provision allowing warrantless access, this time even to contents. So this incident raised the people's concern with mass surveillance by the state and opened the floodgates to the disclosure request to those telcos. So now politicians, journalists, human rights activists, labor union members, members of religious groups, and people from all walks of life have reported that their data has been accessed by investigative authorities. And even KS here got his data accessed by our National Intelligence Service. So this type of communication surveillance clearly infringes on human rights, especially the right to privacy and anonymous communication. And in February 2014, our National Human Rights Commission recommended to the government that the subscriber ID data should only be obtained under the permission from the court, and the permission to be given when there's a reasonable ground for doubt that the suspect has committed the crime and the material is related to the corresponding case. But the government simply ignored this recommendation by our Human Rights Commission. But then on November 6th last year, UN Human Rights Committee said in its concluding observations on the first period report of Korea that the state party should ensure that subscriber information may be issued with a warrant only. So it was a victory for us. So the tide is turning, and I think now is the high time that high time to initiate an international dialogue like this today. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, it was like it's like roller coaster, right? Like she started out with how 11 million accesses made every year in Korea, in a country of 50 million, but ended with silver lining coming through a UN Human Rights Committee recommendation. And that's not the only silver lining. We're going to talk about one other victory here. Now, Chile has for long required court approval for access to subscriber information. And then now we have a new jurisdiction that has instituted warrant requirement for obtaining the identity data of otherwise anonymous communication. So, Nicole, you want to talk about your campaign?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Ozer. I'm the Technology and Civil Liberties Policy Director for the ACLU here in California. And we started off this panel by talking about how there's such a patchwork of laws in the United States, how outdated these laws are, and really just how much sensitive information, whether it be electronic communications information or metadata, is really being accessed by the government, whether that be on the federal level or on the state level, in just exponential increases. So what do we do about it? One of the sort of strategies that the ACLU has been using in recent years, in addition to strategic litigation, has really been thinking about where we could create wedges in terms of changes in actual statutory law. I'm based here in California first of all, it's a lovely place to live, but secondarily, one of the really strategic reasons is because California has very robust state constitutional rights to both privacy and free expression that are actually broader than the United States Constitution. So in the 1970s, the voters in California passed an inalienable right to privacy, which applies both to the government and to private parties. And the moving force of that constitutional right was to address issues of new technology and how it was going to create sort of virtual dossiers about our lives, and to try and give some control back to the people to try and address some of those issues. We have really been trying to use that constitutional right to privacy and the constitutional right to free expression to sort of build the foundation for changes not just in California law, but that will hopefully help to influence law, federal law, and laws across the country. I have been somewhat surreptitiously, but luckily effectively, creating some pretty big changes in California law in the last couple of years. We started in partnership with EFF in 2010, and we drafted the California Reader Privacy Act. And that sort of took a very sort of precise issue of protections, privacy and free speech protections about reading records, digital reading records, and creating a new law around that. And it created a super warrant for California government access to any reading records, which meant anything related to what books you read online or what you downloaded from Amazon. A super warrant meaning if the government wanted access to information about what you read or who you were or what you did, they had to show compelling interest, least intrusive means, provide notice, sort of a very, very high standard. And we did that by saying, look, we're not creating new law. We're codifying the California Constitution, what it was intended to do in the 1970s. Technology has now advanced related to reading, and we need to codify that and create the Reader Privacy Act. We were able to get that signed into law in 2011. People in the sort of library and reading context sort of noticed it, but a lot of other folks didn't notice it because it was sort of a very precise piece. But we were also doing that to create a stepping stone for what we really wanted to do, which was update California law across the board so that there would be a warrant requirement for all electronic information. So that includes all content, so emails regardless of age, digital documents like up on Dropbox, all location information, and all metadata. And particularly post the Snowden revelations, that word metadata, which we released in our report in 2011, talking about how we really needed to dismantle the content metadata distinction, and that metadata should have full warrant protection. When we released this report, it was pre the Snowden revelations, and almost no one understood why we had talked about a report about metadata. But very quickly, that issue and that term became very well known. And we, I guess it was more than a year ago, introduced the California Electronic Communications Privacy Act. I led the coalition to pass that law here in California. The other co-sponsors were EFF and the California Newspaper Publishers Association. And then we created a coalition, the largest coalition I've ever led, of pretty much every major technology company and many, many civil rights organizations here in California to comprehensively update California law for the modern digital age. I'm still amazed. It was the most Herculean effort I've ever undertaken, but we actually got it signed by the governor on October 8th, 2015. It went into effect on January 1st, 2016. Some have said that it is the strongest digital privacy law in the world. And it does exactly what we intended it to do. We never had to water it down through the process. It requires full probable cause warrant protection for a California government entity, whether that be police or another government entity, from accessing electronic information. So it's warrant for all content, location information, metadata, and also for any device searches, cell phones, iPads, etc. It also requires notice by the government entity if they have accessed information. and it also specifically enables the provider itself to also provide that notice. And probably most importantly, aside from the warrant protection, and something I'm incredibly proud of, is that we were able to pass a suppression remedy in that law. So it means that if the government entity does not follow the law, that evidence cannot be used in court. In California in the 1980s, a proposition was passed that said if you wanted to include a suppression remedy in a California law, you had to get a 2/3 majority of both houses of the California legislature to pass that law. We're able to get a 2/3 majority, and CalECBA is one of just a handful of laws that were passed since 1980 and signed into law that have that suppression remedy. So we have a very, very strong law that actually has teeth. We are really only able to do that, obviously, through more than a decade, multiple decades of work in the courts and also on the federal level where we are moving these issues, and then a huge and diverse coalition of civil liberties groups, major technology companies, and also academics from all over the country that really put themselves out there to support this law and say that it really should be signed. So some folks are in this room. I see some of the folks that signed on to that letter, and it really was an amazing win. It's something that now 4 other states have introduced, and we certainly, including New York, we certainly hope that it'll also move the ball forward on the federal level to push these issues. You know, as I say, no good win ever goes unpunished, so we will now have to defend this law in the courts and probably in the legislature for some years to come, but it's a very, very exciting win. It's something that, you know, our office in California and the ACLU generally has really been trying to focus on getting rid of these outdated distinctions, making sure that the law actually matches current technological experiences, and that we don't have these exponential increases in government demands for really sensitive information without proper oversight. So I'm excited about CalECBA. I'm excited to see what the results are, and hopefully we can talk more about it.
This victory is so recent. I mean, it was signed, what, November last
It was signed
year?
in October. Yes. It went into effect in January. And then the one other thing I just wanted to say before I turn it over is that the California constitutional right to privacy has also been a really nice wedge for the issue specifically of anonymity of communications. So the California Court of Appeal in the 2nd District actually pointed to the California right to privacy in saying that if anonymous speech is going to be unmasked, we can't just look at free expression and we can't just look at the dendrite standard. We actually have to look at the California right to privacy, and there needs to be a compelling interest to unmask that speech, and it needs to be balanced with the strong interest in constitutional right to privacy. So we see the California Constitution being an important wedge, not just for statutory change, but also for obviously work that we can achieve in the courts, both on protections for metadata and content, but also to safeguard anonymous speech.
Well, let's give a round of applause for the work in California. And hopefully the federal legislature follows suit in a few years, hopefully. Okay, well, we have a representative from private sector, Ted. So you've heard all the stories. So what do you think about this? I mean, do you think your company will have something valuable to offer?
You know, first of all, I mean, it's really humbling to be up here with this panel, and I thank you, KS, for allowing me to participate. I mean, the discussions and the work you guys are doing is really remarkable. It's staggering. You know, we have our own problems running our little company and trying to figure out how we're going to participate in the conversation. And we can do things like continue to support great organizations like EFF, ACLU, but that's not enough for us. Internally, we like to say privacy is our policy. So what does that really mean? And how do we transfer that to our product and on our consumers? And how do we protect our consumers? And what do we do to increase steps in order to protect anonymity and privacy? So for us, I mean, you know, with freedom, I guess, comes the responsibility of persistent and constant vigilance. So how can we be vigilant in what we do in our activities? We can do things like we don't log any information. that so we don't track any information that people come through our service to use. When we are approached by whether it's law enforcement or anybody, we have policies in place that it'd be much easier for us just to turn around and say sure, and cooperate and do our best to freely give whatever information we have. The fact is that we don't collect much information at all to sign up for our service, and then we don't log any information, so we're not tracking our customers' activities. So it's twofold. One is there are procedures out there that law enforcement has to go through, and while they go through those steps to obtain the right papers, the right documents to deliver to us, we go out of our way to educate and inform anybody who asks what kind of information are you collecting, to show them that we really don't have anything that we can turn over. So even if you go through these steps, there's really nothing that we can do. So we are very serious about any request. Of course, we are very cognizant of what's happening from a legal standpoint. We're compliant, but at the same time, these processes and these procedures are in place because of this amazing history of legal protection that's provided to us and afforded to us. So, for us, we take those steps, we take everything very seriously, and we make it so that we can, on the one hand, inform anybody who comes to us about what we do, our policies and our practices, and on the other hand, be very vigilant in how we approach the steps that law enforcement has to take to come to us and ask any questions about anything. So, from our standpoint, that's, we take our responsibility to our consumers very, very seriously. And there's not one person or one subscriber that isn't afforded all the protections that we can give as an organization. So, that's how we approach our business. We are hyper vigilant in those activities and in that regard. For us, when we say privacy is our policy, that's really what we mean.
Great. So questions. So questions from both the audience and you can join through slido.com or questions from panelists. So I think Khadija had a question. Okay, you're gonna go later. All right. Any question, comment? We can start with a question that came in through Slido. All right. The first question. The reason I'm doing this is my internet access is pretty bad. So, okay, does international human rights law provide any guidance on what legal standards should govern law enforcement access to identity revealing metadata? One answer was already mentioned by one of the panelists, Kelly, that November last year, UN Human Rights Committee, when it was reviewing the human rights status of Republic of Korea, specifically said the state should ensure that subscriber information may be accessed only with a warrant. So that's one. I think that's the first soft international human rights law document that specifically mentioned that. It'd be nice if the UN Human Rights Committee say the same thing when the U.S. is up for review. I don't know when that is. Any panelists want to join?
So I'll answer this, and I have a question for Nicole also. But I think that it's important to look not just at international law at the level of the ICCPR, but it's important to look, obviously, at treaty bodies. And one reason why I think it's not hugely helpful at the ICCPR level is the privacy protections, if we're looking at privacy, aren't as strong, in my view, in the ICCPR as they are in some of the regional levels. So, we haven't talked about Europe, and I don't know how this is playing out so much in the European context. To the extent anybody on the panel can reflect on that, because privacy protection under the European Convention of Human Rights is actually textually stronger than the ICCPR, although the standards in the ICCPR might be similar, but the standards and the implementation are different. So I'd be actually interested if people have experience on that, because I don't think there are too many other concrete standards that answer this particular question at the international level. So that's my first one. My question for Nicole is a little bit, is just about pushback. KS started about on the sort of generic question about anonymity, and I'm just curious about, and this would be a question for everybody too, really, what kind of pushback do you get from legislators on these kinds of issues of anonymity?
Well, I don't know necessarily from legislators themselves, but certainly from law enforcement. Law enforcement is a very powerful force here in California and in the United States generally. There's been a huge coalition trying to push forward an update to the Federal Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which hasn't been updated since 1986. And as we like to remind people, that's before the web existed, so it sort of needs an update. But there's a huge amount of pushback. Obviously, most recently in the encryption debate, the privacy is protected by law or by friction. And the friction has completely disappeared, as Senator Wyden was talking about yesterday. So, there's so much more information available. It's so much easier for law enforcement to access everything about who we are and where we go and what we do. And that means that the law needs to be updated to create those foundational protections. But it's a huge effort. For 10 years, we've been trying to update ECPA, and it has been a long slog. It was 4 years of vetoed bills before we got to the CalECPA bill being introduced and signed into law. And really that was a reflection on, the right bill at the right political moment with the right forces together at play to get it over the political obstacles. The Snowden revelations obviously created a lot more public interest and public knowledge in these types of issues. We did polling in California that more than 80% of California voters, both from the right and the left, wanted warrant protection for their information. That was very persuasive to legislators. We were able to get law enforcement, major state law enforcement, to neutral on the bill and get it signed. But it really was, a very robust coalition of all the major players from the civil rights and civil liberties, area, plus Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft. I've never been on a bill where I actually got the California Chamber of Commerce to be in support of it. So we had major players, TechNet, the Internet Association, and that is what it took to get this bill signed.
I can shed some light on how the police or the regulators see this. There are times that criminal investigations reveal just phone records, like certain phone calls of certain duration were made from one phone number to another phone number, and they don't know who made the phone calls, right? They don't know the identity of the people, right? And there are times that the police can get tons and tons of metadata like that without knowing who made the phone call. So they don't want to go through the procedure of obtaining a warrant for identifying all these people. So what I say to them is that, okay, well, why are you collecting metadata of all these unidentified people, right? The fact that they're doing that to unidentified people means that it is mass surveillance. It's not based on any individualized suspicion, right? So the corollary of that discussion was that this easy availability of identity data facilitates or preconditions mass surveillance. Mass surveillance of just grabbing all these electromagnetic waves going through the air and just accumulating metadata pays off later on only because they can identify without any restriction the parties to the sources of this metadata. That was one exchange I had with investigatory authorities. Luis, you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to mention about the international human rights law and standards. I mean, in Inter-American system of human rights, in which the Article 11 with regard to privacy is practically identical to the one in the European Convention, there are not many cases because, as many of you know, to get a case to the Inter-American court is a path long and dark and full of terrors. No, so. But there is one case, a case of Escher against Brazil, in which the court sees the opportunity to make like general statements about the privacy of communications and what it entails, and it specifically mentioned that it protects not only content but all the data that identifies the communication. So I think there's something that many of us, at least in Mexico, we hold on to when we try to spit that judgment everywhere we can, but there's still a lot of resistance. Just to mention a little bit about the pushback, I agree with many here. I mean, in the case of Mexico, we just get very blunt security, and that's more important than anything. And I think we really need to build, and I think this is very inspiring what you did in California, because you need to show, I mean, they are worried, the prosecutors, for example, are worried that they won't be able to perform their job better, and you have to show them that what you are proposing, it's not going to make their work harder. You may even make it easier for them. And with regard to the judicial authorization, for example, but they say, I cannot, you are asking me to ask for a judicial authorization, and in that time, I might get my victim killed or kidnapped, or will lose valuable time. And we have proposed, and I think the principles also mentioned that the emergency procedures in which you can access the data directly, but simultaneously you ask for the authorization of the judge, and if you get the authorization by the judge, you understand that it was authorized from the start, and if not, there's a moment of detection of a possible abuse of the surveillance powers, and that's a good thing. I mean, there's ways that you can reconcile. When you sit down and talk to them, you convince them, but in the case of Mexico, we haven't been able to really, I mean, you convince someone, but you need to convince more and more prosecutors or law enforcement officials and legislators, and basically in a country like Mexico, which is very top-down, you need to convince the president's office that these measures do not make their work, the security legitimate work harder, and at the same time you prevent abuse, especially as I mentioned, in the context of Mexico, in which you don't know really who you're giving powers to the government or to organized crime.
Yeah, one easy way that the police use the metadata and identity data is to identify people who joined a certain demonstration. So what they do is they do cell tower dumps. So they get all these phone numbers, the numbers of the phones that made the sleep mode connections to certain APs, access points, in cell towers that are located in the assembly area, and that's how they identify who has participated in demonstration. So that's one reason they cite. Kadita, you wanted to say something about that?
Yeah, I wanted to reply to what the question of the DK about the pushback. Well, depend of the country. For instance, in Argentina, they were saying that private data, it was not at the level of protection of the Constitution, because it's not, the Constitution in Argentina only protect the protection of the paper. They use the word papers. But however, there is a Supreme Court decision that says that metadata, they have interpreted that metadata is papers. However, there is nothing, on subscriber information. So it's kind of in the cloud, so you can say, somehow. And so we have a problem with that. But then you have Inter-American decision that Luis mentioned, Escher versus Brazil, to have a more comprehensive level of protection of all the data about the community. In that case, that In Brazil, we have the problem that in the constitution itself, if you are talking about free expression, is for anonymity is forbidden. And so, however, they have not analyzed anonymity from the perspective of the right to privacy. In that case, it wouldn't be an exception, in my view. So we have these laws that authorize direct access of subscriber information directly from the police without a warrant, although I think it might be violating the Constitution.
Okay.
Other piece, I mean, I think something that Luis talked about that we get pushback saying, well, we're not actually tracking a person, we're tracking a phone. We're not actually tracking a person, we're tracking an IP address. And I would just say that that's an area that we try to address both in the government surveillance pieces and in the consumer privacy pieces because they bleed together. So where personal information is defined one way, it has to be consistent or else it ends up, arguing for the other side. And I think we relied on the EU High Court's, rulings that IP addresses are personal information. And in California, the California Civil Code defines personal information really broadly as capable or relating to or capable of being related to any individual. And so whenever we write laws, we define personal information very broadly to include that. But when we do work, I think we need to really focus on what's being discussed in the consumer context as well, because it really implicates how, if the government says, well, you don't think it's personal information when you hand it over to a company, but it's personal when we access it from them, there becomes a disconnect.
Okay. There was one outstanding question that has not been answered. I think the first and the third question have been answered somewhat. The second question is, many non-OECD countries have extremely onerous biometric national ID schemes, some with legal protections regarding ID access. Any thoughts on this? Who is from non-OECD country? Well, anyone in the audience? I know that India has instituted Aadhaar, which started out as an effort to include the huge part of the population that have been left out of their social protection programs. Now, those IDs can become, those IDs will pick up more functions. Right now, it's used only for welfare purpose, supposed to be used only for welfare purpose. But just like in Korea, once a reliable ID scheme is concocted by the state, all these public and private actors, companies, agencies try to use that as a reliable ID scheme. In the end, you will find data. If that ID data includes a national ID number, the extent of privacy breach is even greater. Yeah.
Just quickly mention something about biometric data or even genetical data, which is something that some have proposed, at least in my country. It's something that will be good to identify people, and just to stress the importance and the risk of this. Because, if your phone records or your passwords get compromised, you can get a new phone, you can get a new password, but your biometric data gets compromised. You cannot change your face. Well, you can, but you probably won't be able to it's more difficult and more costly to really get a new identity data in the sense of biometric or genetical data. So in general, these databases of biometric data are just a horrible idea. And we really need to make sure that to understand that in this case of data, it's even more problematic than what we were discussing with regard to communications data or other types of data.
All right. Any other question from the audience? Any comment from the panel? I'm a teacher by profession. Yes? Okay.
How do you find out the number of requests for subscriber data from the telcos? How do you get the numbers?
Oh, there's a requirement in the law that the government should publish the numbers of data requests made, and yeah, yeah, yeah.
Able to get into CalECPA that we originally had in there was a requirement that the California government report how many demands they made to companies for any electronic information. So both the federal law currently and CalECPA don't have those reporting numbers. Now, thankfully, we've definitely been doing a lot of pushes for the companies to release transparency reports, but there is no comprehensive and consistent way for folks to know how much information is actually being accessed and obtained. So maybe we can go back to that and get it in an additional law.
Yeah, but just to get a win for us, it's that we just last year, we were able to make legal obligations for both authorities and companies. So that's very good because you get to also compare and see if someone's lying or what. I mean, they should like really be matched, no? So I think that's a good thing that we've been able to push in Mexican legislation, the transparency reporting requirements for both authorities and companies, telecommunication companies.
Mexico has it, and you can say, well, California has it. Maybe
Yeah.
we can get each other's laws.
Exactly.
Yeah. Data and data. Yeah.
Just to complement a little what my colleague Luis said,
Just, much of what we're talking about has a focus on law enforcement and also obviously law enforcement access to data that's collected by the private sector. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, either for advocates or those who are trying to have conversations with the private sector and influence the private sector on these issues. So you have a model that's very protective, but do you have advice to the kinds of conversations we should be having with different private actors?
Yeah, I mean, it's conversations like this one, right? I mean, for us, we can only do so much to gather the information and try to stay up to speed, but really, places like this is really where the thought leaders come together and share ideas. The internet is a global thing. So, I mean, for us, even though we're based in California, it doesn't mean that we're not doing business everywhere, right? Our products and services are available to anybody. So for us, I mean, we have to stay on top of it, but at the same time, think about these ideas, and every policy change that we make, every business decision that we make has to be guided by some of these discussions. We should be incorporating these thoughts, these ideas, even aside from what's required of us legally. We need to be on top of this from a leadership position in terms of what is on the mind of everybody out there. So, I mean, for us, it's a privilege, and it's never something that, we're learning, right? Every day we're learning, and every day laws change everywhere. The way that people use data, the way that people use technology, it changes every second, and, we're privileged to be part of that conversation, but I would just encourage anybody. I mean, we're really open, I mean, we have an open door policy. We'll talk to everybody, and we want to talk to everybody because everybody's opinion matters. We're in a wired society, and everything that we do will impact somebody else, and we're cognizant of that. So I would just say, to anybody that wants to have this conversation, just reach out. I mean, we're really wide open when it comes to this.
All right. Well, we are a little bit early, but I'm a teacher by profession, and when I run out of things to say in a class, I just end it early. That makes everybody happy. So thank you for listening, and we'll end here. Thank you.
And I brought a few copies of our metadata report, which is our policy report that we use to convince legislators why metadata should have warrant protection. So if anyone wants some copies of it, and also postcards with the link to it online, just come up and grab them. Thank you.
Also, take these one-pagers for reference. It has footnotes. You will be more educated about this issue. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And yeah, I mean, I know that this is